You've been offered 5%. Why is that not enough?
Capitalists want workers to accept lower wages even though they're still making ridiculous profits.
Because 11% is the rate of inflation currently, so that's a 6% pay cut. Why should workers pay the price for problems we didn't cause? Why should firefighters and other public sector workers, and workers anywhere indeed, be told to take a pay cut? What we're being offered is actually a pay cut, and I don't see how anyone justifies cutting pay.
Because the country can't afford it at the moment?
Well, that's nonsense, isn't it? Because some people have done very, very well. There are people who've made millions and millions in terms of COVID contracts. You look at the profits of big business. You look at the very wealthy in society. The government could afford to find £43 billion just a few short weeks ago in handouts to the richest people in society, where they tell workers that we've got to tighten our belts. And we've got people, as your introduction said, now increasingly unable to pay their bills. Firefighters, professionals delivering an essential service being forced to food banks, which has been admitted by our employers and by chief officers. I don't know how you justify that. How does anyone try to justify that situation?
So this TikTok by Trade Unions Congress, where a firefighter calls out the fact that working people are getting a pay cut right now due to inflation, while at the same time, giant companies are still making huge profits. In fact, some companies are even making record profits right now. And yet somehow, all over the capitalist world, we are seeing this inflation, which realistically is just price gouging, because even some private companies have admitted that they are using the talk of inflation as an excuse to just jack up prices for things, and that it's not actually caused by inflation. They are actually the ones causing inflation, because, I mean, think about it for 1 second. Inflation is really just measuring the value of a dollar against goods, services, and capital assets. And there's something that's really important to understand with this, because this inflation is in some sense actually driven by these huge corporate profits. Because what is the value of a dollar compared against? Well, it's obviously compared against the things that you buy at the grocery store, but it's also compared to stocks and bonds and real estate and other capital investments as well. And so when these giant companies jack up prices, that itself directly causes inflation. But there's also another cause of inflation, and that is when a lot of rich people have far too much money. When rich people start to move their money from cash assets, that is to say liquid assets, into more long-term assets like real estate, stocks and bonds, things like that, then you start to see something interesting. You start to see the value of the dollar decrease relative to these capital interests, which of course is called inflation. Now, why does this happen? This happens under a capitalist system simply because of the fact that workers get paid in wages, that is to say cash, and capitalists get paid largely through capital and the growth of their investment, which means there will always be an incentive from the wealthiest people in society to push inflation and to keep inflation high, or at very least just high enough that the wages that they're paying to workers gradually decrease over the time while their investments increase over time. But obviously they don't want inflation to go too fast, because if inflation outpaces itself, then all of a sudden you start to see this demand side problem where working class people can't afford to buy anything, and if working class people can't buy anything, then the entire economy collapses. And so in a sense, inflation is one of the many ways in which working class people get squeezed. But you see all of these countries, these capitalist countries that work for the interests of capital, continue to push to workers this idea that we need to accept pay cuts in order to pay for this inflation. That working class people are the ones that should pay the cost of inflation. But of course these capitalist governments think that, because these capitalist governments that work for capitalists always assume that workers are going to accept the burden of inflation anyway. So this to them is really no different, except it is coming to a breaking point where, especially in Europe where these people are, they are struggling to even afford to heat their homes and to keep their homes warm during the wintertime. But even in the United States, we have people that are struggling to put food on the table. And that brings us to the issue of these demand side economics, which is that if working class people are struggling to afford basic necessities, that's going to cause some major long-term economic problem. But at the end of the day, these giant companies and these extremely wealthy millionaires and billionaires fundamentally don't care, because in their mind, as long as they can get their needs met, they don't actually care about working class people. But that is of course also why there's this massive strike wave across the country, because very much like this firefighter, most working class people, both within the United States and in other capitalist countries as well, are simply refusing to accept the idea that we should all accept a pay cut while these millionaires and billionaires reap extremely huge profits off the backs of our labor.